you to just take a second and reconsider everything you think you know about domestic dynamics. Just pause and ask yourself a question. Did you know that the absolute most dangerous time for a victim of abuse is actually the exact moment they try to leave?
Right. It's a terrifying reality that most people just don't realize.
Exactly. Or consider the legal history for a moment. Did you know that marital rape wasn't fully outlawed in all 50 U.S. states until 1993?
1993. It's shocking when you hear it out loud.
It really is. Welcome to today's deep dive. We have a pretty heavy but an incredibly important mission today. We are unpacking a comprehensive nursing and public health text on violence and abuse.
And our goal here is to move way beyond the standard news headlines, right? We want to truly understand the clinical, the psychological, and the societal realities of abuse.
Yeah, we're looking at how it's identified in medical settings, why it actually happens, and exactly how healthcare professionals step in to intervene.
Reframing this entire topic is really essential. Violence is so frequently viewed strictly as a criminal justice issue, a matter handled by police and the court.
Right, like an episode of Law and Order.
Exactly. But looking at the clinical data, it is undeniable that this is fundamentally a massive public health crisis. It's a crisis that completely alters a survivor's reality, their physical health, and their core beliefs about themselves and the world around them.
It's an epidemic.
It is. It's an epidemic that requires a deeply clinical, empathetic response just as much as a legal one.
Okay, let's unpack this, starting with the sheer hidden scope of violence and abuse. We all know intimate partner violence, or IPV, exists on a broad continuum. It's not just physical.
Right.
But what stands out here is how strictly healthcare professionals are trained to assess the psychological and coercive elements as primary medical risks.
That operationalization is key. When a nurse or a doctor assesses a patient, they aren't just looking for physical injuries. They are evaluating an entire spectrum of coercive acts perpetrated by a current or former spouse, a significant other, or a dating partner.
It's a much wider net than people realize.
It has to be. They are looking for sexual violence, stalking, and systemic psychological aggression. Understanding that full continuum is vital for a practitioner because, in the eyes of a survivor, the world and the home has ceased to be safe spaces.
The statistics are, honestly, they are staggering. And they ground this reality for you, the listener. We are talking about 1 in 4 women and 1 in 10 men experiencing adverse psychological or physical consequences from IPV in their lifetime.
Those numbers are just massive.
They are. When you look around the room at your next meeting or family gathering, those numbers mean you absolutely know someone affected by this. And furthermore, approximately 62% of female murder victims are killed by current or former intimate partners.
Those numbers represent a profound systemic failure. And when we examine the psychological side of that continuum, the distinction between physical and psychological abuse becomes clinically significant.
Because they operate so differently, right?
Exactly. Physical violence might be episodic, it happens, and then there is often a deceptive period of calm or contrition. Psychological abuse, on the other hand, is unrelenting. It is a constant daily barrage of criticism, intimidation, forced isolation from friends and family, and the strict controlling of finances to ensure dependence.
That constant barrage ties directly into the clinical reality of gaslighting. I feel like gaslighting has become something of a cultural buzzword lately, but in a clinical context, it is a devastating, targeted tactic.
It's methodical.
Yes, very methodical. Perpetrators make the victim question their own judgment, their own memories, and their grasp on reality. They downplay the abuse, deny it ever occurred, or completely flip the narrative to blame the victim for provoking the violence.
And the result of that is a survivor carrying an immense, entirely unearned burden of guilt. The psychological toll of that manipulation breaks down a person's self-esteem until they feel entirely responsible for their own victimization.
Which is incredibly hard to undo clinically.
Absolutely. But to fully grasp the scope of this public health crisis, we must expand our parameters beyond adult partners. Early victimization has profound, lifelong ripple effects. Teen dating violence is a prime example of where this cycle often begins.
The data on teenagers establishes a terrifying baseline. According to national survey data, 1 in 11 female and 1 in 15 male high school students reported experiencing physical violence by a dating partner in just the last year.
That's a critical window of development.
It is. Healthcare providers have to screen a teenager with the understanding that this violence is actively shaping their developing brain's definition of love and conflict.
Experiencing violence during those formative adolescent years leads to a drastically higher risk of victimization during college and into adulthood. It normalizes coercion.
It sets a dangerous precedent.
Precisely. And moving to even younger demographics, the clinical distinction regarding child abuse challenges common assumptions. When the public hears child abuse, the immediate image is physical violence, an act of commission. Yet, the most prevalent form of child abuse documented by healthcare workers is neglect.
Neglect operates as an act of omission. It is the chronic failure to meet a child's basic physical, emotional, educational, or healthcare needs.
Which makes it so hard to spot.
Right, because it's incredibly insidious. It's not necessarily an overt action a practitioner can easily see, but rather a profound absence of care. Nurses are trained to look for clinical signs like developmental delays, failure to thrive, severe dental decay, or consistently missed medical milestones.
That omission is exactly what makes it so hard to detect and intervene. And you see a similar subtlety on the opposite end of the age spectrum with elder abuse. This affects roughly 1 in 10 people over the age of 60 who live at home.
And it breaks another common assumption.
It does. The most frequent type of elder abuse isn't physical, it is financial in use.
The tragedy of elder financial abuse is that it is overwhelmingly perpetrated by the very people the older adult relies on, their family members or designated caregivers.
It's a deep betrayal of trust.
Completely.
Hmm.
Clinically, a healthcare provider might notice a sudden, unexplained inability for an elderly patient to afford vital medications, or a caregiver insulating the patient from other family members to maintain control over their assets.
Identifying these varying forms of abuse naturally leads to analyzing the root causes. It is tempting to write abusers off as people who simply have terrible anger management and are prone to snapping.
That's the narrative we always hear.
It is, but clinically, that narrative of losing control falls apart under scrutiny. Many abusers exhibit flawless self-control in public settings. They navigate workplace frustrations, interact with neighbors, and handle daily stressors without ever resorting to violence.
The fact that an abuser can entirely refrain from angry outbursts in public strongly suggests their violent behavior behind closed doors is not an impulsive loss of control.
Not at all.
It is a highly calculated choice. It is a behavior executed specifically in an environment where they hold absolute power and face no external witnesses.
This brings us to the psychological mechanics of how that behavior is acquired, specifically social learning theory and the intergenerational transmission of violence.
The idea that violence is learned.
Exactly. If a child grows up experiencing harsh physical discipline or constantly witnessing violence in their home, their developing brain wires its conflict resolution pathways around aggression. They learn, through observation, that violence is a legitimate, effective tool to solve problems and maintain dominance.
Building on that psychological foundation, we also have to recognize the historical and societal structures that reinforce these dynamics. The material outlines how imbalances in relationship power, deeply rooted in patriarchal systems, play a massive role.
The history is really important here.
It is. Historically, legal frameworks considered women and children as property over which the head of the household held absolute authority. Using violence to enforce that authority was a legally and socially accepted practice for centuries.
That historical context is crucial for understanding how recently the legal landscape has shifted. It wasn't until 1994 that the United States passed the Violence Against Women Act, or VOWA.
1994 is not that long ago.
It really isn't. This was the first major federal policy designed specifically to combat interpersonal violence, providing vital civil rights protections, funding for domestic violence shelters, and specialized training for law enforcement.
Looking at the policy history impartially, it is notable how fragile these legal protections can be. While VVUA fundamentally changed the response to domestic violence, the legislation actually expired in early 2019.
Right.
As of the mid-2020 publication of the clinical source material we are examining, it had not yet been reauthorized by the Senate. It underscores that federal support structures for survivors are subject to complex legislative processes.
Those structural vulnerabilities are deeply compounded by external stressors. When households face severe economic, social, or medical stress, the baseline risk for violence skyrockets. One of the most sobering parts of this clinical material is examining the profound impact of the COVID-19 lockdowns.
Here's where it gets really interesting. The way modern circumstances and tools operate as an intense double-edged sword for survivors. The pandemic essentially weaponized isolation.
It trapped people.
It did. Stay-at-home orders created an environment of extended, inescapable contact with abusive partners, removing the daily reprieves of work or school.
Abusers utilize that isolation to systematically tighten their control. The clinical reports detail how perpetrators would withhold access to necessary daily medications, hide health insurance cards, or leverage global travel restrictions to completely dismantle a survivor's carefully laid escape plans.
They had nowhere to go.
Nowhere. The abuser became a constant, omnipresent force, monitoring every single communication.
Technology's role in that monitoring is terrifying. Perpetrators utilize networked devices, location tracking on smartphones, and spyware to stalk their victims. But simultaneously, the internet served as an absolute lifeline for survivors trapped at home.
It was their only way out.
Secure telehealth portals, 24-hour digital hotlines, and reliable support websites became their only link to the outside world.
The design of those digital lifelines reflects the constant danger survivors face. Resources are engineered with rapid escape buttons that instantly redirect the browser to a harmless generic web page the moment an abuser walks into the room.
That's incredible design, but also so bleak that it's necessary.
It is. Healthcare providers also have to constantly remind patients to clear their search histories and cache files after seeking help.
When we look at the clinical realities of the isolation, the digital tracking, and the psychological torment we just discussed, the common cultural question of why don't they just leave really exposes a deep misunderstanding of the danger involved.
It's the most pervasive myth out there.
Leaving a violent home is not a single, decisive event.
Leaving is a highly complex, incredibly dangerous, and often prolonged process. The data emphasizes that many victims will leave and return multiple times. They are forced to navigate a labyrinth of building a secure support network, gathering hidden finances, and securing safe housing.
And the timing is everything.
Most critically, the period of attempting to leave is medically and statistically recognized as the time of absolute greatest risk.
The moment a victim attempts to leave, the perpetrator's ultimate control is fundamentally threatened. This is the exact window when violence frequently escalates into severe physical harm.
It's when stalking behaviors peak.
And tragically, it is the most common time frame for an abuser to commit homicide against their partner.
Combining an immense justified fear of lethal retaliation with systemic hurdles like profound economic dependence, a lack of affordable housing, or the terrifying prospect of losing custody of their children in a legal battle, it becomes entirely clear why staying often feels like the only viable strategy for survival.
It completely shifts the paradigm. Instead of judging the decision to stay, healthcare professionals marvel at the resilience required. This complex reality creates a highly nuanced dilemma in the medical world regarding mandatory reporting laws.
It's a massive ethical debate.
Healthcare providers, particularly nurses, are designated as mandated reporters. But the protocol for intimate partner violence differs drastically from child or elder abuse.
This raises an important question regarding the balance between patient safety and patient autonomy. With children and vulnerable older adults, nurses are legally obligated in all 50 states to report known or suspected abuse to protective services.
Which makes sense because they are dependents.
Right. However, mandatory reporting for adult IPV is a subject of intense ethical and clinical debate. Reporting an assault without the competent adult patient's explicit consent can create a massive barrier to them ever seeking medical care again.
The unintended consequences of forced reporting can be catastrophic. The material provides specific, difficult examples. Mandated reporting of IPV might trigger an automatic investigation by Child Protective Services, a system which data shows disproportionately impacts and scrutinizes Black mothers.
That's a huge systemic issue.
It is. For undocumented immigrants, discussing IPV might ignite intense fears of contact with law enforcement and subsequent deportation. Or it could immediately cause the fatal retaliation from the abuser we discussed earlier.
From the perspective of nursing ethics, overriding a patient's agency violates a core tenet of medical care. If a nurse forces a competent adult patient into a police investigation against their explicit wishes, that act of denying them their autonomous decision-making is essentially a secondary form of victimization perpetrated by the healthcare system itself.
Because of these incredibly high stakes, nurses operate on an incredibly challenging tightrope. They must act as medical professionals, empathetic advocates, and highly observant detectives.
The clinical training is rigorous.
The training for reading the hidden signs of abuse during a routine assessment is remarkably detailed.
Practitioners must be hypervigilant. They are trained to look beyond obvious trauma and search for clinical discrepancies. They analyze whether the physiological mechanism of an injury matches the patient's explanation.
So if the story doesn't match the wound.
Exactly. If a patient presents with a complex spiral fracture but claims they simply tripped over a rug, the medical evidence contradicts the narrative. They also note behavioral flags, such as a patient wearing a heavy turtleneck in the middle of a summer heat wave to conceal bruising or burns on their neck and arms.
The specific clinical indicators for infants are particularly striking. The developmental timeline is used as a diagnostic tool. Infants do not possess the motor skills to move or ambulate independently prior to 6 months of age, which is generally when they begin to crawl.
Right.
Therefore, a bruise on a non-mobile infant under 6 months old is always treated as a severe medical red flag. The clinical maxim is, babies who can't cruise, don't bruise.
That kind of diagnostic precision is crucial. And once a practitioner identifies these potential signs, the method they use to inquire about the abuse is a masterclass in trauma-informed communication. They explicitly avoid using loaded or definitive labels initially.
Medical staff are trained to avoid terms like abuse, battered, or rape during an initial screening because a survivor might not yet identify their experience with those severe labels.
It can be too confrontational.
Instead, they use broad, non-judgmental, open-ended questions. They might ask, when there are fights at home, have you ever been hurt or afraid? Or simply, it looks like someone has hurt you. Tell me about it.
This phrasing creates a safe, destigmatized space for disclosure. If the patient does choose to disclose the violence, the immediate verbal response from the healthcare provider is arguably one of the most critical moments in the intervention. It sets the foundation for the patient's entire trajectory of recovery.
The validating messages outlined in the clinical training are incredibly powerful. Nurses are instructed to maintain eye contact and clearly state, I am really sorry this happened to you. I am glad you told me. It was not your fault.
That is so important.
After years of enduring targeted gaslighting, being manipulated into believing they caused the violence, hearing a licensed medical professional definitively state it was not your fault can be completely life-altering.
That validation begins the psychological healing, but the immediate clinical priority instantly shifts to physical survival. Practitioners utilize specific diagnostic instruments, such as the danger assessment tool, to evaluate the immediate risk of homicide.
What does that assessment involve?
This tool requires asking highly targeted questions about the escalation of the violence. They assess if the partner exhibits extreme jealousy, if there's a firearm present in the home, and crucially, if the abuser has ever attempted to joke or strangle the victim.
Strangulation is flagged as a massive, overwhelming predictor of future lethal violence. If the danger assessment indicates a high risk of homicide, the intervention moves directly into rigorous safety planning. This is far beyond simply handing a patient a resource pamphlet.
It's a tactical operation.
It is highly tactical, logistical planning. It involves mapping out a literal physical escape route from the residence and establishing covert code words with trusted friends to signal an emergency without alerting the abuser.
Safety planning also involves preparing a hidden escape bag stored outside the home if possible. The logistics dictate packing a spare set of car and house keys, emergency cash, necessary medications, and vital legal documents, birth certificates, bank account numbers, and health insurance information.
Everything you need to start over.
Exactly. These are the logistical necessities required to completely sever a life and an identity from the perpetrator.
Only after that immediate physical safety is secured does the incredibly long road of rebuilding begin. The public health approach is deeply pragmatic about this timeline. It relies heavily on frameworks like Maslow's hierarchy of needs.
You have to build from the ground up.
Right.
A survivor's physiological and safety needs, meaning secure, violence-free housing, consistent food, and reliable childcare, must be firmly established before they can even begin to process the trauma.
You cannot effectively implement trauma-informed cognitive behavioral therapy if the patient is terrified about where they will sleep that night. Once the foundation of safety is stable, the psychosocial interventions can begin. For children who have grown up in violent environments, a primary clinical intervention involves teaching them a violence vocabulary.
Giving children a violence vocabulary is such a profound concept. It equips kids with the specific words needed to articulate their trauma, to accurately assign responsibility to the abusive adult rather than internalizing the blame, and to firmly understand that the dynamics they witnessed were neither normal nor acceptable.
It is the first step in actively breaking the intergenerational cycle we discussed earlier. Without that vocabulary, children only possess the aggressive conflict resolution models they observed.
They need new tools. They do. The therapeutic process also focuses intensely on teaching anger management and emotional regulation to both abused children and adult survivors. They must learn to recognize anger as a normal emotion and express it assertively rather than aggressively, entirely relearning how to resolve conflict without resorting to the violence that governed their past.
So, what does this all mean? We have navigated a tremendous amount of dense clinical ground today, moving from the psychological mechanics of coercion to the ethical tightropes of medical intervention.
It's a lot to take in.
What we hope you take away from this deep dive is that abuse is rarely as simple as a clear-cut villain and a passive victim. It is an incredibly complex web of economic entrapment, deeply ingrained fear, historical power dynamics, and raw human survival.
Understanding the architecture of that web is what ultimately shifts societal outcomes.
Knowing the clinical reality is understanding the intense danger of the escape process, recognizing the subtle signs of neglect, or seeing how an abuser weaponizes both isolation and technology changes how you view the world around you.
It really does.
It equips you to be a much better, more empathetic ally in your community, in your workplace, and within your own family. You move past asking judgmental questions and start recognizing the hidden realities survivors navigate every single day.
And to leave you with a final thought to explore on your own, consider how the landscape of abuse is evolving right now. If leaving is clinically recognized as the time of absolute greatest risk, how does the rapid integration of smart home technology, think remote-controlled locks, network security cameras, and shared GPS tracking ecosystems, fundamentally change a survivor's ability to safely escape? And how must modern medical safety planning evolve to address this new era of digital captivity?
That is a deeply complex and urgent question for the future of intervention. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive today. We invite you to take these insights, keep questioning the narratives around you, keep learning, and as always, stay curious.